Hey everyone, Sycra here, and today I'm going to be doing a critique of one of the forum members over at the Sycra.net forums. Alright, so here we have a picture of Thor, and he's holding his hammer and he's looking pretty powerful. And I think you did a good job on making him look powerful, getting a pretty good pose, and you mentioned that you had problem with the coloring. The colors you picked are pretty good, but I do see what you mean, especially when I see, like the ground has sort of a texture to it, and then the sky is quite messy. And especially my biggest problem is the way you rendered the clothing, his arms, things like that. It's all using a soft brush, and it creates this, I don't know, dirty or fuzzy look, especially with gradients. And some areas are okay. I mean, this looks okay, but it's nothing that you need to be ashamed of, because a lot of beginners run into this issue. And the way I deal with it is to not focus on this fuzzy, soft airbrush way of coloring, but rather to focus a little bit more in a cel-shaded manner. So I'm gonna do this in time-lapse, but just show you what I mean. Alright, so I'm just gonna block in the flat colors, and the way I do it, and I'm not saying you have to do it this way, but there's a bunch of different ways to cel-shade. But the way I like to do it is to isolate the character separately, and here I'm using the lasso tool, both the polygonal lasso and the normal lasso tool, and I'm just blocking in the big shape. So pretty much all you need to worry about is the silhouette of the form, and then what I'm going to do is divide that after the fact into, the cape and the helmet and the beard and things of the same color. And maybe I'll explain how I'm going about doing that in a different video, but yeah, as I said, you can do this a bunch of different ways, and the reason he's on his own layer and, separated from the background is it's just so much easier to light things that way and to keep things orderly. Okay, now I'm blocking in the shadows, and this is really the important thing that I wanted to cover with you. It's that your lighting is muddy, and I'm using a very flat cel shading way of coloring right now to block in the shadows. And it's not that I'm saying you need to adjust your style to become cel shaded, but rather that working in a cel shaded manner will really help you to figure out where shadows should go. It forces you to be more specific about, okay, this part's in the light and this part's in the shadow. Whereas when you're using a more soft or painterly coloring method, you can kind of noodle things. And I started out doing cel shading, and then I moved more painterly. And I found, like, now I'm going back to cel shading, and what I'm learning is that it reminds you of all the basics, right? Making colors that work well together, and having fixed areas or definite areas of shadow and definite areas of light. And again, it's not saying you need to do this as a final, but that more like this would be a good exercise for you. And how I'm doing it, I'm just using a multiply layer, and I have it clamped down to this mask, so wherever I work, it's just going to be on the character. And I'm just blocking it in, and you'll notice like the cape got blocked in. And now when I look at yours, I was a bit confused because there's a sky behind him, which would probably be adding some rim light to him, and maybe it would be throwing the whole front of his body into shadow. But then he has his eyes that are glowing and are probably going to light things up, and then his hammer that's glowing, and for me that's just way too complicated. So I simplified it, and I'm just making it as if the hammer is a light source. And so what that's going to make me do is like, okay, well, if the hammer is a light source, then, there's going to, this part's going to be in shadow, or that part's going to be lit up. And I think, as I said, it's just a good way of learning. It's a good exercise to be able to color this way. And it's also very easy to go from cel shading into a more painterly look. Pretty much all you're doing is you have the shadow, you have the light. Well, in the light, you add more light. In the shadow, maybe just add some reflected light, soften some of the transitions. So, it's not hard to go through from one to the other, but I would recommend probably, give it a shot to train yourself to get better at doing this kind of shading, or to think more about the shadows and to be much more precise, because the problem with soft things and fuzzy things is they give you fuzzy results where you're not really sure what's going on here. Okay, so now it's pretty much finished, but I'm going to change some things. So here I have the line art on its own layer, and I said that the hammer is a light source, so I'm just going to lighten the hammer itself, and maybe I'm going to make it white. So it's pretty easy with this method of cell shading. I just take my paint, what is this? Paint bucket? Yeah, paint bucket, and select white, and just fill that, and it's going to fill anything of that color. So I'm just going to select around the hammer so it only fills the hammer. There we go. So now the hammer's lit up, and to me that makes a bit more sense than the way you had it where light's coming off, or I guess it's lightning. But anyway, I guess the way I'm thinking of it, even if there is lightning, the hammer might be glowing itself. And the other thing is that this background, this yellow, I don't know if it's working too good, so I'm just going to hit Control U, see if I can change it to something that might add a bit more contrast, right? Maybe something less saturated and much darker. Maybe something like that. So we'll go with that for now, and just going to add some effects. So now I'm going to actually use the soft brush more, and maybe I'll create like a glow around this hammer. So let me just take some light blue, just go around the rim. And what I'm making sure of is that my brush is bigger than it needs to be. So in the beginning I was sort of, I had it a bit small and I was doing that. But this is what creates all that muddiness. It's when, let's say I wanted to add a nice gradient from the sky. Well, if I use a small brush and say I'll just overdo it and just make a really ugly color, just for example. Let's say I do this, right? And then I'm scribbling it in. And even if I take advantage of the pen's pressure and sort of ease up as I go down, you'll see how it gets very muddy. So the trick is to make your brush huge and then to start, blocking it in. You see how much smoother that is? So that's the problem that a lot of people have, is they're just not using a big enough brush, and that's why they're not getting nice smooth gradients. Because if I do it with a soft brush, I can get it look that's almost as good as if I just use the gradient tool, except I have a lot more, that doesn't even look half bad. I have a lot more control, right? Because I could maybe say like, oh, I want some yellow, but I only want it to affect a certain area. So I could do things like that, and I don't know, that looks sort of comic booky, but that's just, should I keep it? Just tone it down a bit. And again, you could go back to your yellow composition. The only reason I don't like the yellow is that it is too, it's too similar to the colors of him. And I mean, that harmonizes it, but at the same time, he doesn't stand out enough. Now what I can do, well, I could add a bit more variation to this blue. Make my brush bigger. And see, now it sort of looks like the hammer is glowing, right? And you could do the same thing to the eyes if you wanted. Okay, and let's say I wanted to add like more shininess to the metal. You could do that as well. Like I could just make a color dodge layer and just do it to this shoulder thing, pauldron, to give the idea. Use like a dark color to begin with, just so I can put down where this would go. And because now I have a clear light source, it's going to be easier to know where to put that stuff. And I can erase parts that aren't supposed to get lit up. And anyway, you get the idea. So I could add stuff if I wanted to add some reflected light. I could do that too. Just on the back side of this thing, for instance. Let's just use some of that green. So I wanted a bit of reflected light. See, now that starts to, that form starts to turn. It's almost like it was much more painted than it really is. Even though it's cell shaded, you can pretty easily start to make these forms read. But anyway, it's not so much like what I'm trying to teach is not so much how great cell shading is, and to switch to cell shading as a method, but more just the importance of using it as a way to practice where to put your shadows, so that you don't end up with very messy things like this, and to get away a little bit from all this texture stuff that I know when you look at digital art, there's a tendency to get fascinated and fixated with all the little tricks you can do. And I mean, it's not like cell shading doesn't require little tricks, because even with what I just did with the color dodge layer, that's a digital trick. But to focus on, you know, big areas of shadow, just the basics. Where's your light coming from, right? And then that will stop some of this muddiness that's going on. And if you are going to do gradients, use a big soft brush, and that's why selections are really useful. Because let's say I use, okay, let's see, just make a shape. Let's make a shape like so, right? Now, if I wanted to add a nice gradient, one way is to look at that and then to take a small brush and just like a coloring book to start to color that. And then maybe I want it to get light like this color, and then I want it to get darker as it goes down, and then to ease off. But see what's happening? See how ugly that is, right? So that's why I personally would use something like the lasso tool, and then just trace the shape. Switch to a soft brush, and then make my brush big. And now it's only going to go within this object, right? And then I could create that nice gradient, right? So hope that helped, and thanks for watching.